Welcome to the Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures podcast. The aim of the podcast is to bring to light new stories, new perspectives on mountain landscapes and mountain communities around the world with help from a wide range of expert guests. We're going to be showcasing exciting new academic research on mountain history and some amazing work by creative practitioners engaging with mountain landscapes in a range of different media. I'm Jason König from the University of St Andrews.
And I'm Jonathan Westaway from the University of Lancashire.
Co-directors of the Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures podcast project together with Jonathan Pitches from the University of Leeds. It's a great pleasure today to welcome Alexandra Cotofana. Alexandra's assistant professor at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi. She's a cultural anthropologist. Her research and teaching explore intersections between environmental anthropology and science and technology studies. Alexandra's got a huge range of research interests, but most relevant for us today, she's the author of a book published in 2022 entitled Xenophobic Mountains, Landscape Sentience Reconsidered in the Romanian Carpathians. The book was shortlisted by the European Society for Environmental History for their Turku Book Prize in 2023. She's also co-editor of another amazing volume, Sentient Ecologies, Xenophobic Imaginaries of Landscape, also published in 2022. Welcome, Alexandra. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. We're both big fans of your work, so it's really exciting to have the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Jonathan, both for having me. I'm very excited about today and to tell you the many stories that I have about mountains.
Fantastic. Great to have you here. I'd like to start today just by asking very simple question, really. How did you come to work on mountains in your academic research? And how far is your own personal experience of the mountains of Romania part of that story? How far has that personal engagement helped to shape your research?
So I grew up in Bușteni, which translates to English into logs, which tells you everything you need to know about where it is. It started as a logging community in the Romanian Carpathians, it should be said, because Carpathians are not only in Romania. And it was the house of my grandparents that my family and I moved in when we were 7. Until then, we were sort of migrating wherever our engineer parents had work. And then when we started school, I guess it was important for them to give us a stable identity. And we moved into the same house as my paternal grandmother. And so that is the place that I consider to be home. That is the most formative place of me growing up. But it was a while until I thought about it as a research site. So growing up, I hiked a lot. I walked through the forests a lot. Then I left for my PhD in 2013 to the US. My research was about Romania, but my field sites were up in the northeast by the Ukrainian border and in Bucharest. So again, I didn't think of home as a space of research. And then as more time passed, a lot of different insights from the interviews were bringing me back home. And so even though the books that I have, you don't see them directly related to my dissertation, after I've matured out of my dissertation, I thought of home as a research site, and I've started to write about the mountains where I grew up as a research site.
Great. And I guess sometimes anthropologists are studying cultures they're quite distant from, but I guess there's some quite different challenges involved in working with a community that you're quite close to or a place that you know really well. It'd be really interesting to hear a bit about that.
And I write about this in my books and in some of my articles. I think anthropology as a discipline has a guilt towards others. We don't really study home. Anthropology traditionally has not studied home. It has followed colonial enterprises to the elsewhere, and that's where indigeneity was. And the here, the European here, the Western here was not something to be studied because it was normal. The exotic was always elsewhere, and the exotic was the thing that needed to be studied. So as we know, literature has since moved closer to home, and the native anthropologist has become more of a figure in anthropology, and I guess that is what I am in these books. I am the native anthropologist.
Right. Yeah. Just one other question before we move on to talk about the book. I just would love to know a little bit about how you viewed the mountains, what the mountains meant to you, particularly when you were younger in your childhood. I mean, you talk about hiking there, presumably when you were in your teenage years or later. But when you were growing up in your early years, were you aware of the mountains? Did you think about them? What did they mean in the community you were a part of?
So we used to visit the mountains. We used to visit my grandparents when we were children, before we turned 7. My twin sister and I'm going to say we a lot because I think of us as a unit. But I didn't start thinking about the mountains until we moved in the house where we ended up living, which was owned by my grandparents. And there was a rotunda, just a half circle room with windows on all around. And so if you went through the door and if you went to the left side, you could see the Bucegi Massif, which is one of the most imposing mountains I've ever seen. And one memory that I have about that mountain and watching it every day is that I've never seen it look twice the same. So every day the clouds on it differ. You can see the seasons turning on it. There's a cross on top of it for the war heroes of World War I, which is a simpler war to make heroes out of. In the Second World War, Romania changed sides. So that would have been, I think, a more controversial cross to make. But sometimes that cross was lit up. And that's when we knew that the town hall is doing well financially. And sometimes they didn't pay the electricity bill. A very big cross, actually. I think it's over 20 feet tall. So that looking at the mountain in the evening already told you something about the local economy sometimes. And these were all conversations taking place in the town that trickled down to the children. And so we started learning things about the mountain very early on.
Amazing. Thank you. That's really great to hear. I wonder if we could just move on then to talk about your Xenophobic Mountains book in particular. The subtitle of the book is Landscape Sentience Reconsidered in the Romanian Carpathians. It's quite striking that early on in the introduction, I think you use the phrase about taking this concept seriously. You ask your readers to take the concept of a xenophobic sentient mountain seriously. Could you give us a brief overview of the book and also what you mean? What is a xenophobic sentient mountain? What do you mean by that concept?
So I think it's very important for the listeners who maybe are outside of our discipline or maybe just the general public. Within the discipline of anthropology and its sister disciplines, we recently in the last 20 years, we've had a move called the ontological turn. This move asks us to take other worldviews seriously. And this obviously comes as a response to colonial worldviews where only the rationalism of the West matters and is objective and is true, and things from around the world are not as true. So this is who I'm speaking to. I'm speaking from this point of the ontological turn, asking people to take a concept seriously that you wouldn't normally think about taking seriously. There are some layers to this idea of xenophobic sentient landscape. So I think everyone's okay with the idea that a landscape exists. That one we don't need to discuss. The second layer is important because we don't think about it very much, which is that mountains have sentience, the fact that they are alive. And this is a very recent thing, I believe, that we don't think of the lithic as being alive. What is something that is alive? It's something that moves. We don't think that rock moves because we don't see it move. And so the most helpful academic contribution in this way comes from, for me, it was from Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who looks at stone. He has a book called Stone, An Ecology of the Inhuman, published in 2005. And that was the book that really helped me develop this theory because he speaks about the fact that we are so stuck in human time that if something moves slower than humans do, we don't see it moving, so we assume it doesn't move. But mountains shift all the time. As we speak, mountains shift. We have tectonic plates that move. We have mountains that always squish together. We know that this is how mountains were created, right? By movement. So that's another thing, right? Mountains are alive. They move, they change. The lithic historically has been considered as something that is alive. Greeks and Romans thought of stone as living stone, as something that is alive. In the medieval times, people also thought about rock as being alive. So now we're only thinking about the European context, right? So let alone all the other ontologies of other people in the world. Recent moves in the ontological turn also think about glaciers as being alive. So it's not uncommon. It's just something that we need to make peace with as people who think with a certain kind of rationalism and secularism. And the third layer is xenophobia. And this is something that comes in within the disciplines, because looking for literature to support what I was seeing in my data, I noticed that whenever researchers were speaking about sentient landscapes, it was always somewhere very far away in formerly colonized spaces. It was the people of the islands, the people of the global south, who thought that their landscape is alive. So again, we have a problem here with not taking other ontologies seriously. So it's very important to me that the work that I'm doing happens within Europe, a marginalized version of Europe, Eastern Europe, but still Europe nonetheless. And within my work, the mountains were not being nice. They were not being Gaia-like. So even if we go down to Bruno Latour, right, he speaks of the planet as Gaia. It's a mother that feeds. We are the children, all of us, all of the living things. We are children of this mother, and it's always kind. This mother cries with its children when others occupy it. So it was very important to me to find this reality, this ethnographic data, where we look at the entire complexity of what it is to be alive. And all of us who are alive, we're not just good. We also have moments when we're selfish and we're mean. And that is really what nature is. Nature is, on this planet at least, nature is not very kind. That's why we need culture to domesticate this nature within us.
That's absolutely fascinating. Can we drill down into some of that in a few questions, Alexandra? I think for some people, the notion of mountains as being alive will be a step too far, a real challenge to their concept of how the world is. You talked about the ontological turn. There's been a non-human turn, new materialism and various forms of assemblage theory that ask us to take seriously the idea that things have agency, but stop short of suggesting sentience. And as you've already pointed out, the notion of sentient and agentic landscapes is usually encountered in anthropologies of indigenous and animistic societies. But here you are as a native anthropologist in Romania, which some people have characterized as peripheral to Europe in many ways. What first inspired you to apply this interpretive framework to your ethnographic fieldwork in contemporary Romania?
So again, because home is not a boring research site, not a boring research topic. I say this as often as I can because I want to encourage my own students to be native anthropologists. My research was started by something that was happening in my actual home, in my actual house, which is that my own father, after retirement, found a completely new world on Facebook, where none of the things he was finding were questionable. That's where truth was. And he spoke to me quite a bit about conspiracy theories that he didn't think of as conspiracy theories. He thought of them as truths while I was studying conspiracy theories in my PhD. So a lot of them came back to the Carpathians. It's very easy to disconsider these ideas, especially when they come from elder family members, I think, because it's a very seductive idea that people can be like us and think like us. And I think it's very hurtful maybe sometimes when we see that not happening. So again, I rejected looking at home as a space of conspiracy theories for a very, very long time. But then I thought, what happens if I become flexible? Because at this point, both my father and I were rigid. So one of us had to become flexible ontologically and epistemologically as well. So I decided to become flexible and to try to understand where is he coming from? If these ideas were coming from Facebook, how many people were following them? What do they mean? What kind of demographics were we looking at? Were they indigenous ideas? Were they imported ideas? Were they a mix of indigenous ideas and maybe conspiracy theories from the West? What were they exactly? While I'm asking my own audience to take this concept seriously, I was the first one to have to do this exercise myself and try to understand, are these ideas meaningful? And one episode actually that started the book, what ended up happening 2010, there was an IDF helicopter. The IDF and Israel are in the news quite a bit these days. So the Israeli Defense Force had a helicopter that crashed in the mountainside very close to my hometown. It made regional news. Obviously, it was in the Israeli news and in the Romanian news, but it also made an appearance on these websites that my father was following. And that is where the story became interesting because of how it was interpreted. So first of all, what was the IDF helicopter doing in Romanian mountains? And second, why did it crash? What crashed it? In the view of this tribe, It was the mountain who crashed the idea of helicopter. I really mean who, because people were thinking as of this mountain as being alive. So once I made the exercise with myself of being flexible with this ontology, I also looked at how many people actually shared the story and shared this article. And I think it went to over 100,000 people of direct shares. And then in comment sections also, only on Facebook, because I was only interested in this particular way of exchanging knowledge that my father was involved in. But what I noticed is a significant demographic, but not everyone was retired. A lot of people were still in the workforce. A lot of people were in their 20s and 30s, women and men. So while I started by thinking that my father was exotic by being a retired engineer in rural Romania, these ideas were flowing in between demographics, in between social classes, in between diaspora and people in the country. So that's when I truly took it seriously and I started to write about it.
Thank you. And we'll probably come back and talk a bit more about these kind of ontological pluralities in this context. So you've been on a journey of being open about the possibilities of many worlds being explored by different people, but you've also edited a volume, Sentient Ecologies, where you were working with other academics around the world who were also coming up with examples of xenophobic and sentient landscapes. And you indicate in your introduction that some of those contributors found the idea of sentient xenophobic mountains a continual challenge through the process of writing the book. Could you say a bit more about that process of working with other colleagues and how they address those challenges, and kind of did your perspective change through editing other people's work, engaging with their kind of struggles to come to some kind of consensus around these concepts?
So that's a very good question. Let me take our listeners through the journey of what this was in case it inspires anyone or in case anyone's thinking about doing this. So once I came to terms with the fact that my father's idea was only exotic to me, but it was shared by many, then I tried to find other people in my field who were doing research on similar things. And I was just going to a conference in Sweden, and it was on the far right and ecology. And I went through the list of participants and I noticed the name of a scholar. His name is Hikmet Kuran. He ended up being my co-editor on this book, and I just reached out to him. He was studying Germany and the far right and how the far right thinks about the landscape, the far right interbellic and Second World War far right, how they thought about German landscape as being kin to the German people and how only the German people understand the landscape. And so any immigrant of any sort or any ethnic other of any sort would only be able to harm the environment because they didn't speak the same language of the German environment as the ethnic Germans did. So I thought this is as close as someone can get to my research topic. So then we met in Sweden and we talked about it, and he didn't think I was crazy, which was a very good start. So I invited him to co-edit this, and then we sent out a call for papers very shyly and not really thinking anyone would answer. And then we had a bunch of abstracts submitted. We did have cases from South Africa, Canada, Romania, India, Germany, Spain, Japan, Chile, Croatia, and the Czech Republic. Very validating to me that this data that I was finding that had started at home, that it was a very good idea that I took it seriously, because here was something that was finally taking shape. So we had a workshop with all the authors, and in the case of the Croatian co-authors, they were talking about how immigrants are hiding in the forests of Croatia and trying to go through to countries where they want to settle, and how different groups of right-wing people in Croatia think of this as a polluting force, and how the migrants don't know how to navigate the forest very well, so they get caught up in all of these political and ecological trouble. But as time went by, I realized that these Croatian co-authors, they still reached out and they still wanted to be part of the conversation. They still wanted to publish. So my conclusion is that they had their own ontological crisis where they felt there's something there, there's something deeper about this topic, but they just didn't know what to do with it because they themselves did not think that landscape has life. We kept the chapter because we thought it's valuable. But I think this is what happened. I think they were having their own ontological crisis, which is important to say academics have as well. We also have trouble taking others seriously and thinking deeper than what we were taught, and maybe trying to dismantle some things that we were taught within our culture, within our discipline.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear how that even within that group you had, that concept was something that needed to be debated and viewed from a range of different perspectives. So actually, Alexandra, you've almost actually kind of answered the next question what I was going to ask, which is about how far we can scale up this model and see it as applicable to other regions and other places. And I'm asking that partly because my own interest, I work on ancient Greek and modern Greek texts and contexts, and really a lot of what you're talking about in the book is so resonant with the material I'm familiar with. So that amazing description of the helicopter crash and the description of the way in which the mountain was imagined to have caused that is just like what you see in this ancient Greek texts on the mountains as forces repelling the invasion of the Persians in the 5th century BC, for example, or ideas about the mountains as refuge from Ottoman rule in the 19th century and so on. So yeah, it's amazing to think about how this can be scaled up and used for other regions. But then the question I wanted to ask was really just about where these ideas are coming from, and particularly thinking about how important the context of occupational, colonization, resistance might be for these ethno-nationalist ideas. So just to give a bit of context, I suppose we tend to think of mountains positively in Western or Northern European culture. You kind of said this already, with they're benevolent, they're therapeutic, they're restorative. Whereas, as you point out in the book, a lot of anthropological work on indigenous society thinks of mountains rather differently, perhaps as protective spaces. I think you use the phrase protectors of the powerless, the colonized, the indigenous. And the Romanian example seems to take us closer to that second model. So yeah, I'd be really interested to know where are these ideas coming from and how important are those contexts.
So for listeners who may not know very much about Romania and the story of the nation of Romania is pretty young. It started in the 1840s, much like Switzerland, actually, which is where mountain tourism starts. I'm not bringing up Switzerland for no reasons. So Switzerland thinks of its Alps the way that Romania thinks of its Carpathians. And there's this story of indigeneity, that Romanians are people of the land. But then there are also stories of occupation. And it's very important to note that there are two kinds of occupation, desired occupation and undesired occupation. So in the story of Romania, which was Dacia at that time, the Roman Empire coming, a Western empire, coming in and occupying, when the Ottoman Empire comes a little later, not so desired of an occupation. Right, so a much more, very masculine still, but a very orientalized other, just as civilized, a culture that's just as deep, but just not so desired. So the Carpathians come in both stories as being spaces of protection where the indigenous people can run to and they can hide from these occupying forces. Even in the case of the Roman Empire, we have the story of a Dacian princess, the sister of Decebal, who is the local king at the time. Her name is Dokia. Very unclear if she's an actual historical figure or not, but a feminized indigenous being. This is very important. She hides at the very top of the mountain, very close to my hometown, the massif that I'm speaking about, and she rejects the advances of the Roman king, who desires her beyond reason. And she asks the Dacian gods to turn her to rock. So her and her helpers end up turning to stone. And these stones are part of the lithic tourism that we see up in the massif close to my hometown. So, and then with the Ottomans, we hear this story time and time again in national imaginary that we were the wall that stopped Ottoman conquering of Europe, which is not true because the Ottomans made it all the way to Vienna. So it turns out they found a way around the Carpathians. But if you hear all of the stories around the Balkans, we were all the people who stopped the Ottomans, but we were all singular in our force. And each of the people has sort of the same story. We were underarmed, understaffed, and somehow with the help of this lithic, with the help of this ecosystem that is kin, we managed to keep these imperial armies away. In the Romanian case, we see this as swamps and mountains and the fog coming in at a very important military time. And then this imperial army that doesn't know the landscape very well falls into this trap set together by the people and the landscape. This is not crazy if you think about the fact that in Afghanistan and in Vietnam, the American army falls because they don't understand the landscape very well, and the local people understand the landscape. So you can see how this way of thinking can develop.
That's really interesting. This idea of the kind of weaponization of the pastoral, as some people have termed it, is very interesting. But in Xenophobic Mountains, you outlined something quite distinctive, a kind of a long history of biopolitical eco-fascism in the region. And you show how contemporary resistance to outsiders has been directed by mountain communities in the contemporary period at lowlanders and at tourists, at people coming from outside the region. So this idea of resistance has kind of metastasized somehow in contemporary society. You're very nuanced in your analysis, Alexandra. You're very careful to point out that the West is not necessarily rational and the local is not necessarily superstitious. And you've already talked about how your own father became enmeshed in these conspiracy theories around the landscape, the mountains resisting foreigners. I think it's fair to say that Western polities at the moment, political institutions are facing a crisis of cohesion and legitimacy, often driven by hostile epistemologies and kind of post-truth rhetoric and far-right imaginaries. So I was wondering, how might your research help us understand a broader kind of right-wing shift to populist ethno-nationalism in Eastern Europe? And you might want to perhaps reflect on the recent presidential elections in Romania, and where there was a strong right-wing candidate, who very nearly won the presidential elections, was voting for figures like that. Is it geographically determined? Is it rooted in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania?
So I'll get to the Romanian elections, which were very interesting. It was a whole season, 2024, 2025, and I'll get into the depth of that for some of the people listening who, again, maybe don't have so much context. I would say that a lot of these biopolitical eco-imaginaries that everyone has, this is very important to say, I say this very often, nature is right-wing, culture is left-wing. It is our job all the time to domesticate in ourselves this idea that there is an other that is less than us, that deserves less humanity, less dignity than us. Some of us do a good job, some of us don't. Some of us do a good job for a while and then we slip, as my father did, who, mind you, I am the product of my father's education. So I was very shocked to see where he was headed in his late 60s. So this nature culture reality, I think we need to make peace with it. I think we have this hope that at some point all the societies are going to be left-wing. I'm sorry to disappoint people. I don't think that is going to happen. It's a fantasy, I think. So I think we need to study the right wing in a continuum. Most of us don't have the time and the resources to do it in a long continuum. But I think if you take out a slice of 100 years, you can see some cycles and at least you can know what to expect, because in this particular moment in 2025, the world is not looking very good. And it's important to understand it didn't come out of nowhere. It has some roots. I think a lot of the historical conflicts we're looking at are issues of immigration, who belongs to the land and who doesn't. The Holocaust is an issue of this sort, right? So in Romania, we think often of refugees and others coming from the south. In Romania, traditionally, people have come from the north and the northeast. So Jews in Romania came in the 1800s from the Polish and the Russian empires, where they were having all sorts of horrible trouble. They came down to Romania. It was a clash of cultures. It was a clash of a middle class coming into a peasant society. So a lot of jealousy and hatred came out of that. It didn't help that they were culturally and religiously different. That really helped shape them as an other. We see the exact same thing with the Syrian refugees in 2015, where this idea that the Ottoman Empire is reconquering Christian Europe settled right into the national narratives of ethno-national states. We have a big problem here because ethno-nationalism has always won in front of civic nationalism. So who is of the land and who is not of the land is a very easy seed to plant in the mind of people. The Israel-Palestine conflict, time and time again, goes back to who was here first, right? Who is the immigrant and who is the indigenous people? So this idea of who is not of here, who is other, is extremely problematic. And this was used also by right-wing politicians in Romania in the most recent elections. So even though the elections ended in May, which is officially when we're recording this, it's last month in Romania, the Romanian elections were actually in November of 2024, which is when a guy who came out of nowhere to most people, Călin Georgescu, in the primaries, he got the most votes. People were very surprised. It was an anti-system vote. Romanians have long, as I'm sure Brits have and people around the world have been disappointed with the political choices. And in their minds, everyone was voting for an independent. So it was not a terrible move to make. But very quickly, independent journalists have found that he had funding from both the Russians and the American far right. Thanks to his very open rhetoric praising Nazi and right-wing leaders of the Second World War, we now have a new law that was passed a few days ago against people speaking publicly in positive ways about right-wing leaders of the past. So that election was annulled. A new set of election was started. George Simion, who is younger than Călin Georgescu, and who has been on the political scene for a longer time, he has this party that I wrote about. They started in 2019, and I was writing about how a lot of the language of his party, which is called AUR, which in Romanian means gold, very good marketing scheme because Romania has the biggest gold mine in Europe, which a Canadian company has tried to take over, and it was a whole move of sovereignty where, again, left and right worked very well together to kick the Canadian company out and to claim our gold. Second World War, the Russians took our gold and never gave it back. So to call a party AUR is marketing gold, truly. So this is what he did. Very good move. George Simion is not an intellectual, doesn't claim to be an intellectual, but behind him he had a very good ideologue, Claudiu Târziu. In the meantime, they divorced. But Claudiu Târziu was very, very good at cleaning up and reusing interbellic right-wing ideology and concepts. So this is what I wrote about. In the meantime, without Claudiu Târziu, George Simion didn't have much of an ideological, just set of concepts to work with. So he made it very clear that he's very aligned with MAGA, the MAGA movement. He reached out to a few politicians, secondary politicians around the European right-wing scene. He lost the presidential campaign by 5%, which is significant. So he couldn't make such a big argument. While as in Poland, most recently, we see that the difference is much smaller. And so this is what happened to the elections. It's very, very interesting that once Călin Georgescu became a public figure, people also noticed the people immediately behind him. And these are people that I've already written about in my monograph. So one of them is Eugen Sechilă, who was in the Foreign Legion, and he organizes camps for young men and young boys where they can reclaim their Christianity and they can learn to fight, to be ready for invasions.
Presumably these camps are in the mountains?
Of course, they're in the mountains. Very unclear who's invading, very unclear when they're invading, what kind of weaponry we need, but they are being armed psychologically, first of all, which is the most important thing, because with ideology, you can't do anything. He is married. I'm giving everyone some right-wing tea from Romania. He's married to the daughter of a right-wing fighter dissident from the 1940s, 1950s. Very interestingly, Gogu Puiu and everyone in that group, they were not ethnic Romanians. They were a-Romanians or Vlachs who were coming from northern Greece, where they were treated as second-class citizens. They came back to Dobrogea, which historically they can lay some claim to, And they immediately worked their way into militating for ethno-nationalism. Corneliu Codranu, one of the biggest figures in the Romanian interbellic right wing, born with a Ukrainian last name that he had to Romanize. George Simion admitted in an interview that he's Roma. So we look at all of these tragedies at the end of the day of people who try to whiten themselves in some way to be part of ethno-nationalism, and then they become the weapons of something that they should fight against.
Yeah, I mean, you've shown brilliantly how the mountains are a part of that story.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we'll perhaps come back a bit later to how mountains structure these new political ontologies in the region. I just wanted to come back to the ontological turn that you mentioned earlier on and talk about the work of Mario Blasa and Marisol de la Cardenia and their idea of the ontological pluriverse in relation to indigenous life worlds. And they talk about rejecting the notion, as you've hinted already, that there is one nature and many cultures, but they suggest a multi kind of ontological world. And you talked about your kind of openness as an academic to exploring these multiple ontologies. And particularly in Xenophobic Mountains, you talk about the ontological lumber that constitutes ethno-nationalist beliefs in Xenophobic Mountains. So I wanted to ask, to what extent do you consider these beliefs actually to be constitutive of a plurality of worlds? Or to put it another way, do hostile epistemologies underpin hostile ontologies that you've been exploring?
Again, for the listeners who are maybe part of a broader audience, it's important to talk about this idea of ontological furniture, which is a term coined by Philippe Descola. In 2014, it was a very useful concept for me in thinking about xenophobic sentient landscapes. And I personally think one of the clearest concepts to think about a multitude of worlds. So Descola thinks about ontology in terms of elements, and he really describes it very simply. Each one of us grows up with different kinds of furniture in the house, right? So you're from the UK and you grow up in a certain kind of house, you know what a chair is. But if you grow up in the UAE, where I currently am, right, you have the idea of a majlis, and everyone sits around on the floor and eats communally. So ontological elements are very much like furniture elements. We grow up with them, thinking of them as normal and natural, but then we go in the house of someone else, right? We have intercultural friendships and we realize they don't have chairs, or they don't sit on the ground, and they don't eat with their hands off a carpet. So I find this very, very useful. To make it brief, absolutely, I think hostile ontologies and hostile epistemologies work hand in hand. I think we're all hostiles. Hostile, I think it's a question of what are we hostile towards? What is the object of our hostility? Right? Even if I'm hostile towards right-wing politicians, I'm still hostile towards something. So I think it's very hard to embrace everything. Like, we all work based on our moral compasses.
Thank you. I had a question about the refugee crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean and the movement of refugees through the Balkans. And to what extent the refugee crisis in the region has fueled this ethno-nationalism linked to ideas about ecology that you talk about. The Carpathians are quite distinctive in that they run through the center of Romania. In other countries, mountain spaces have become securitized border zones. Is that happening in the Romanian Carpathians, or has the refugee crisis in the region fueled this kind of ethno-nationalism, nationalist resurgence?
Okay, so for anyone who's wondering what Jonathan means about the geographical setting of the Carpathians, imagine Romania in the shape of a fish, maybe Dory from Finding Nemo, a rather wide fish, and the Carpathians run through it like a gill, like a very wide gill. So they really separate the head of the fish, which is Transylvania, from the rest of the body of the fish, very simply put. There's a historical reality tied to that, which is that for 1,000 years, Transylvania was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then in the First World War, Romania lost other territories, but we did get Transylvania. So there's some Hungarian mourning and pain related to that. There are families on the border who know exactly which British general drew up that border, what happened there. They know the years. They remember exactly how the families felt. And then Romanian nationalism has written the Carpathians into the national history to fit that colonization. Yes, there were Romanian ethnics in Transylvania, but there were also Czech, there were also Germans, there were also Roma who are traditionally stateless. So it's not to say that Romania deserved Transylvania. Sometimes when it fits us, like when the Syrian refugees come through Romania, the Carpathian Mountains again become the tall border that helps Europe withstand Ottoman invasion. Right? So there's this orientalizing, the Muslim that's always invading, coming in. Poor Syrian refugees have nothing to do with the Ottoman Empire. And Syrians traditionally didn't have a great life during the Ottoman Empire. So it's a very hypersimplification of what the Muslim is. Then when we want to integrate Transylvania into the national identity, there's a Romanian poet called Ana Blandiana. She wrote a poem. We all had to memorize it in first grade. I remember the photo also, that Romania is a bouquet of flowers. And the Carpathians are but a set of flowers in this bouquet of flowers. So suddenly the Carpathians are soft. They're flexible, semiotically flexible. And part of my book, the last chapter of the book, looks at maps and how different maps make the Carpathians either very soft or very hard based on what role the national imaginary needs them to serve.
Fascinating.
Thanks, Alexandra. I just thought we'd maybe finish in the last few minutes by looking ahead and talking about the future, both perhaps your own research and more broadly. So one of the projects all three of us are working on together, along with others, is a history of mountains and mountaineering through objects. This is going to be a book that draws in lots of different contributors, exploring different objects from mountain history. In turn, I'm sure we'll talk about that more in later podcasts in this series. I just wonder if you'd be willing to give us a very quick glimpse of the object you've chosen for your contribution.
Thank you. I'm very excited actually about this collection. I thought I'm done with the topic of Romanian mountains, and then you guys reached out with this collection, and I thought it was so exciting. And the chapter that I pitched is about the mountain chalet, and so I'm taking 3 mountain chalets from Romania to mirror some of the realities that are happening. So I'm looking at the Omu mountain chalet, which is very close to my hometown. This is now a meteorological station, but it was built by a Saxon Transylvanian organization that were all about mountain tourism. Really, they were very, very close to the SS. And they were getting congratulatory letters from the SS on their work of establishing the very clear German-Romanian friendship within the Second World War and before that. So that's one chalet that's looking at, I'm actually looking at that chalet to see how it changed from the interbellic fascism to then Romanian communism, and then to neoliberalism and what that meant instead of it in terms of its ownership. Then I'm talking about another mountain chalet that is actually built by a dissident during communism. It wasn't so much as of a chalet at the time that he was there. He made it. It was very DIY. He just had to survive the winters. And I spent several winters there with a group of mountaineers. It's very hard to reach. You have to ice pick up a mountain. I talk about it in the book. I hated every second of it because we always went there in the winter, but it helped you understand why it protected this man for several years from the communist regime that was out to get him. And then the third one is the Karaiman cabin, which I can see from the window of my parents' house, which was one of the many chalets to be a victim of neoliberalism after 1990. It is completely dilapidated. Many of them are, even though the mountains are still a big thing in Romanian national discourse. A lot of these chalets that are state property, completely dilapidated, they're locked. Mountaineers cannot go there anymore. And this one was bought off by a British citizen, actually. This one is the only one that's getting some updates. Is still standing, literally standing, but it's completely off the market. And the fact that the state also sold some of these, put them on the market, this is also meaningful for the space of the mountain that is so important to the nation. What does it mean in this neoliberal world when we sell state-owned mountain chalets?
Fantastic. It's great to get that sneak preview, but I can see it's an amazing way of telling this story, writing this history right through the 20th century. Are there other things you'd like to mention, Alexandra, about the role mountains have played in your recent research or future research plans, perhaps as a guiding thread that ties together different aspects of your research?
Yeah, so I think intentionally or unintentionally, I keep coming back to mountains in my work. I single edited a volume called The Familial Occult about anthropologists who have witchcraft in their families, which I am one of. And I talk about how the mountains that I grew up in played a huge role in how gossip about the witchcraft of my grandmother traveled the small mountain town that I grew up in. Currently, I'm more focused on science and technology studies, and I'm looking at cloud seeding. But without mountains, you cannot have cloud seeding because you need the updraft to build up a cloud that is fertile enough to be cloud seed.
Fantastic. And then just a final couple of pairs of questions. The first is really to ask whether you've got any thoughts about what future opportunities and challenges you see for mountain history, mountain anthropology, if that counts as a discipline. What can we do to study mountain communities and mountain regions better?
I'm very, very worried about defunding social sciences and humanities, which has become a practice in a lot of neoliberal governments. I think especially right-wing regimes have a lot to gain when we don't study power and we don't study people anymore. And so it's also important to study places that they use within their discourses. And mountains are a big space for sovereignty and masculinity. How do we maintain the nation strong and so on? I think this is very, very important. Mountains have come up recently in the Iran-Israel conflict. People talking about how Iran is like a fortress because it has mountains all around. All of its border regions have mountains. This also means it's a perfect site for a nuclear bomb, I think. So that fortress can work both ways. Yes, you cannot invade them by land, but who's invading people by land in the 21st century anymore? No one. But it's dangerous to have mountains all around, I think, in the political climates that we have now. So I think having mountains in the back of our mind constantly, it's very, very important what we do with mountains, what mountains matter and what mountains don't, right? We think about mountains that are close to deserts, which are considered not so important, even more hostile. And then the European mountains that are green, that are worth conserving, and that they're more alive than the other mountains. So I think mountains are very, very important to think with.
Fantastic, thanks. And then just one final question, really, just to take us back to where we started, actually, with the community that you grew up in and the place you grew up in. It's really just to ask, what future do you see for the Carpathians and the people who live there? And what are the opportunities? What are the challenges? And how would you like to see your own work make a difference to those communities and also in other similar mountain regions around the world?
I hope my own openness about my own life and my own journey as a human, but also academically, I hope it helps people also become more vulnerable. And when we are vulnerable, when we put all of the pieces of ourselves on a table and we can look at them, we can also analyze objectively which parts of us we don't really like and what we would like to work on. And so I hope that by looking at these cycles, at these continuums, at these problems with the left-wing and right-wing ideologies that are part of all of us, I hope that I can foster more empathy in people and help us understand that we need to accept that these parts of society exist. We need to be in conversation. It is very, very useful to right-wing politicians when we're divided, when there's no space for dialogue, when there's no space for any kinds of partnership. And I'm hoping that my work can help us look at these cycles, political cycles that keep coming and going, and can help everyday people ask themselves, who is it really benefiting when we're divided?
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Alexandra. Thanks for telling your story. It's been fantastic to talk with you today. Thanks to Zofia Gettin for editing. Thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us. We'll have more episodes coming up over the coming weeks and months. We're going to be exploring a whole range of new perspectives on mountain history, mountain experience. So please keep tuning in. If you'd like to support the project, please do share our podcast with others in your networks. If you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Mountain Stories, Mountain Futures, or get in touch directly via the project website. Thank you for listening.